In this lecture, we are going to look in more detail at two parts of speech, the adjective and the adverb. Let's first look at adjectives. Adjectives are words that modify nouns and pronouns, and they only modify nouns and pronouns. Adjectives are usually placed before the noun or pronoun they modify, so they're usually easy to identify. And when we're trying to identify an adjective, we can ask the questions, which one, what kind, how many, whose. The answers to these questions are the adjectives. The second part of speech that we'll be looking at in this lecture is the adverb. Adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs. That's all they modify. So the important thing to remember here, adjectives only modify nouns and pronouns. Adverbs modify verbs, adjectives, and other adverbs. So when we're looking at a part of speech, we can determine whether it's an adjective or an adverb based on what word it is modifying, what part of speech the word is that it is modifying. If it's a noun or a pronoun, we know it's an adjective. If it's a verb, an adverb, or an adjective, we know it's an adverb. The tricky thing about adverbs is that they can be moved around in the sentence. Like I said, with the adjective usually appears right before the noun or pronoun that it modifies, but an adverb can sometimes be located remotely from the word it is modifying. So that requires a little bit of skill in identifying what word the adverb is modifying when it's not next to the word it's modifying. How do we determine that? Well, adverbs answer questions such as how, when, why, where, to what extent, on what conditions. Notice these questions are different from the questions that an adjective answers. Another way to determine if a word is an adjective is by its ending. Some adjectives, not all, but some adjectives are formed by adding endings to the noun or verb form. For example, the endings AL, ABLE, FUL, ISH, IVE, LESS, and simply Y. These forms added to the noun or verb form are adjectives. So for example, we have the word professor. If we add IAL to the ending, we have professorial. Or believe, we have the verb form believe, and we have the adjective believable. ABLE is added to the word to make it an adjective. Fright, we can add FUL and the noun fright becomes an adjective, frightful. Sheep, the noun sheep becomes an adjective by adding ISH, so we have sheepish. And then we have rest, the noun, restive, an adjective. Sleep, a noun. Sleepless, an adjective. Scare, a noun or verb. And scary, an adjective. As you probably know, many adverbs are formed by adding ly to the adjectival form. So for example, frightful as an adverb becomes frightfully, or sheepish as an adjective becomes sheepishly. As an adverb, bold becomes boldly, selfless becomes selflessly. The caution, however, is that not all words that end in ly are adverbs. For example, we have the adjective lonely. He is a lonely man. Lonely is an adjective modifying man. I didn't mean you any bodily harm. Bodily is an adjective modifying the noun harm. Or you silly goose. Silly is an adjective modifying the word goose. So not all ly words are adverbs. You need to be careful about that. And the other thing that, of course, you need to be careful about is that not all adverbs end in ly. For example, we have the adverbs well, not, now, never, and ever. These are condition or time or why words or how words, so they are also adverbs. With what I've just said about adjectives and adverbs, it would seem that they're pretty easy to follow. So let's look at a few problem areas where adjectives and adverbs often get confused. Remember the general rule, adverbs follow action verbs where adjectives follow linking verbs. It's with linking verbs that we often have problems. So all forms of the verb to be, verbs such as appear, become, seem, sense verbs that are not that when they're not used actively, such as taste, feel, smell, look, sound. These all require adjectives, not adverbs. So, for example, Seabiscuit ran quickly to the finish line. We have an action verb here, ran, so we use an adverb, quickly. But Seabisc is quick. Is a linking verb, therefore we need an adjective on the other side of the linking verb, quick, not quickly. Or Seabiscuit looks skinny. Looks is a linking verb, so we use the adjective skinny to describe Seabiscuit. All right, let's look at a couple more problem areas with the sense verbs that can be both linking verbs as well as active verbs. He smells bad. In this case, smell is a linking verb describing and the adjective following bad describes he. He smells bad means he needs a bath. He smells badly, on the other hand. In this case, smells is being used as an active verb, so we need to use the adverb that modifies the verb smell. He smells badly means there's something wrong with his nose. So linking verb and adjective, action verb and adverb. And another rule to remember is make sure that you use an adverb to modify an adjective, not another adjective. Adjectives cannot modify adjectives. Adverbs modify adjectives. So the sentence properly, he smells really bad. Really is an adverb modifying the adjective bad. As I'm sure you remember, both adjectives and adverbs have what are called comparative forms and superlative forms. A comparative form is used when two objects are being compared, and the superlative form is used when one object is compared to multiple other objects. So let's go through some of the rules for those, starting with the rules for comparative and superlative adjectives. If the adjective is one syllable, we form the comparative by adding er to the end of the adjective or est at the end of the adjective to form the superlative. If the adjective is two syllables and ends in y, then we change the y to I and add either er for the comparative or est for the superlative. If the adjective is two syllables and does not end in y, then the preferred usage is to form the comparative by adding the word more before the positive degree and to form the superlative by adding the word most before the positive degree. Just as we form the comparative or the superlative with adjectives of two syllables that don't end in y, if an adjective is more than two syllables, we form the comparative by adding the word more before the positive degree of the adjective and form the superlative by adding the word most before the positive degree. So let's look at some examples. We have a one-syllable word, old. We form the comparative by adding er, so it's older, or the superlative est, oldest. Pretty, two syllables, ends in Y, so the comparative is formed by converting the Y into I, so we have prettier, and then for the superlative we have prettiest. Beautiful is three syllables, so we use more beautiful to indicate the comparative and most beautiful to indicate the superlative. And then, of course, those are all positive degrees. If I want to do a negative degree, so I use, instead of more, I use less, so less beautiful. And instead of most, for the negative degree, I use least beautiful. So that's how we have comparisons of both positive and negatives. Positive is or ascending comparison is more and most. It's the equivalent of adding ER or EST to one syllable adjectives, or the descending comparative comparison is used with less and least. Let's look at the rules to form comparative and superlative adverbs. Unlike adjectives, adverbs are a little less complicated because most of the time we create a comparative adverb by adding more before the adverb, and we form the superlative by usually adding most before the adverb. Even though there are a lot of adverbs that end in Y, we generally do not make adverbs comparative by adding ER and superlative by adding EST. We usually use more and most. However, there are some one-syllable adverbs that do form their comparatives like adjectives. So fast, for example, is an adverb. Faster is the comparative. Fastest is the superlative. Or soon is an adverb. Its comparative is sooner, and its superlative is soonest. So there are exceptions, but generally the rule is more and most before adverbs. Of course, English wouldn't be English if there weren't some irregular forms that we have to memorize, and comparatives and superlatives are no exception. So let's look at some of the irregular forms. We have the adjective and adverb, bad or badly, and the comparative is not badder or more badly. The comparative is worse for both adjective and adverb, and the superlative is worst. These words get often confused, worse and worst, because of the similar sound. So pay attention. Worse is the comparative, and worst with a T is the superlative. Think about it, it's ending in ST, so it's the superlative. Far. Far is an adverb, and we have two forms of the comparative depending on what we mean. Farther when we're talking about distance, or further when we're talking about extent. And then the superlative follows suit, farthest and furthest. Then we have the adjective adverb pair, good, well. Good is the adjective, well is the adverb. The superlative form for both of them is better. And the comparative form for them is better. The superlative form is best. Then we have little. The comparative form is less, and the superlative form is least. Then we have much, many, some, and several. All of these have the same comparative form, which is more, and the superlative form most. Another problem area that we often see is something that is wonderfully said in German, doppelt gemoppelt, which means unnecessarily doubled. So we would not correctly say, I am feeling more better today. Better is already the comparative, so we don't need more. Or, she is more prettier than her sister. Again, prettier is already the comparative, so we do not need to add the word more. Another rule to consider is that we do not make comparisons with absolute words. There's no such thing as more unique. Unique is an absolute. It's either unique or it's not unique. Empty, the same thing. It's often used as a comparative, but emptier, but it's technically not correct. Something is empty, then it's an absolute. Same thing with full or dead. You can't be more dead. You either dead or you're not. It's an absolute. One I see a lot is pregnant. She's very pregnant. You can't be you're pregnant. It's an absolute. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You're either perfect or you're not perfect. Something is round or it's not round. It can't almost be round. It is round or it's not round. So there are words like that that in the English language should not be used in comparisons. One final problem area that I would like to point out is our increasing tendency to use nouns as adjective. In some circles, it's becoming accepted to use nouns as adjectives to avoid awkwardness. And in my career as a technical writer and also in my career in computer programming, I have to say I was also guilty of this, making nouns into adjectives. In formal English writing, however, you should try to avoid doing that. Now, some nouns as adjectives have become accepted in common language, so I doubt you'll find anyone who objects to coffee pot or teapot or milk carton or sugar bowl or dog food or paper towels, even though all of those first words are nouns, they're being used as adjectives to modify the second word or the noun following. But as a rule, if you have an acceptable adjective, and if an acceptable adjective already exists, then use the adjective. Don't use a noun to replace the adjective. And also, you should avoid stringing nouns together as adjectives. Like, for example, I've seen this on our health forms, a medical expense reimbursement form. That's typical technical writing jargon or medical jargon, but it's all, if I were writing an essay, I probably wouldn't write that. I probably would write, here is a form to reimburse medical expenses. Then we have no nouns being used as adjectives there. Medical is a valid adjective. Or instead of saying doctor's office visit, we could just say visit to the doctor's office.